Today's Sunday, March 24th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today, again, Palm Sunday, at Mass, we read through the Passion narrative, and as I was listening to the reading and thinking about it, I realized that in our Lord's teaching to his disciples is really found the key to discerning one's vocation. We talk about this idea of discerning one's vocation all the time. Usually young people are tormented by this idea of discerning their vocation. And I think we can make it very simple, actually. Very simple to determine one's vocation. And we always have to remember that one's vocation is not a destiny. I think many students struggle because this idea of vocation, which literally means calling, has the idea of a destiny or fate, as if God intended for the person to do something, and they have to figure out what that is and do it, or else they're in trouble. That's not what vocation is. Vocation, it can be translated calling, but it can also be translated invitation. A vocation is a calling, like calling on someone. It's an invitation. It's not a decree. It's not one's destiny or fate. And so one is not discerning a vocation to find out what one specific thing God has destined them to do, but a person is discerning with free will. With free will, a person is discerning how they can serve God according to their own understanding in the best way possible. I think it's easy to discern how this can be done by reflecting on the most important words that Jesus ever taught his disciples. He made it very clear that his will for his disciples was simple and general. What he said was, "Love one another. As I have loved you, so love ye also one another." That is God's will for our lives. God's will for our lives is very easy to understand, and it's true for every single person. God's will is that we love one another. And he went on more practically and specifically to say, "No greater love is there than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." So what it means to love someone, what it means to love our neighbor, to love our brothers and sisters, even to love our enemies, it means to lay down our lives for them. No greater love is there than that. No greater love exists than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And now we can sit around in idleness and sort of dream about being a martyr or something like that. But many of us will never have the opportunity or circumstances that require us to become a martyr. However, all of us, to a degree, can lay down our lives for our friends or neighbors or even enemies. So this idea of laying down your life must be a matter of degrees. So for example, if a person does any of the works of mercy, he is in some sense, to some degree, laying down his life for his friends. If I take of my own money that I've earned and I give it to someone else, I'm taking a risk that I may enter into some financial trouble because the money that I would have had, I gave to someone else. So there is a risk-taking, and you can see how to a degree, in sharing with someone else, I'm laying down my life for my friend. And this is true of any of the works of mercy, anything we do. Anything we do for the sake of others is, to a degree, laying down our life for our friends. And of course, some people are given the opportunity, which they receive freely, of actually laying down their lives to the greatest extreme for their friends. And Jesus says, no greater love has a man than this. And so when Jesus says no greater love, he also teaches us that there can be degrees of love. So there is, one act can be less loving than another, one can be more loving than another. And so in discerning our vocation, it's not even necessarily one specific thing like a career or an occupation. And I think that's part of the confusion, is this idea that this is an all or nothing single item that we've got to figure out, when really the vocation in the Christian life is simply to love, to lay down one's life for one's friends to some degree. And one's friends extends, of course, to our neighbors, even to our enemies. Jesus taught us that. No greater love is there than to lay one's life down for his friends. That's what love is. And Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you. And Jesus gives us the extreme, the perfect example of what love looks like, and says, it is my will that you love one another, even as I have loved you. So love ye one another. And so the question for discerning our vocation is not, what should I do with my life? Should I be a priest or a monk, or should I get married, or should I be a doctor, or should I be a housewife, or should I be a farmer, or should... That's really not the question we should be asking, because a lot of that is determined by providence. A lot of those practical, occupational details are determined by providence. If God doesn't provide you, for example, with a good spouse, then you shouldn't marry. If you're not provided with a devout spouse, then I don't know how anyone could argue that they should marry. You shouldn't just marry anyone and say, oh, I'm called to marriage. So a lot of this is in our own control, but a lot of it is not in our control. If a young person doesn't have any money or support, he can't just say, I'm going to be a doctor. Medical school costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. You don't just go be a doctor. You're dependent on providential circumstances with respect to these sorts of financial or occupational issues. It's all kinds of connections and opportunities and resources and so on. You don't just make up your mind what you want to do unless you're just foolhardy and you're going to spite yourself and end up, going into enormous debts just so you can say that you fulfilled your goal. Well, nobody cares about that. You may end up achieving a goal that wrecks your whole life. But occupational things, I think those are much more determined by evaluating the circumstances of our life, providential opportunities, connections, resources, and so on, and making the most prudent decision. But as far as discerning a vocation, or just discerning our vocation in general, it's very simple. We're to love our neighbor. We're to lay down our life for our friends. That's what it means to be a Christian. That's what it means to follow Christ. My wife had some interesting thoughts on this recently, because she's studying a course at the Catholic University of America right now, and it's a liturgical catechesis course. So they're studying the liturgy and the different aspects of the liturgy, and she's reading some great stuff about the sacraments and the liturgical aspects of the sacraments and so on. And one recent article that she was assigned to read talked about the words that Jesus speaks at the institution of the Eucharist when he says, "Do this in memory of me, do this in remembrance of me." And this article comments on the fact that Jesus is presenting the disciples with the bread and the wine of the Eucharist, and he breaks the bread and he said, "This is my body, which is broken for you." And then he takes the cup and says, "This is my blood, which is shed for you." And he says, "Do this in memory of me. Do this in memory of me." And for most of us, when we read that, and for me, I've always read that, and I've just thought about, okay, the bread is Jesus' body, the wine is Jesus' blood, and Jesus wants us to do this, that is, to celebrate this sacrament in remembrance of him. That's how I always thought of that, and how I always reflect on it. We are celebrating the Eucharist and carrying out this sacrament because Jesus said so. He said to do this in remembrance of him. But this article went further than that and said Jesus is asking more from us than to simply continually celebrate this sacrament, because the sacrament has a message built into it. And the sacrament is, "This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you. Do this in memory of me." And the article explains that what Jesus urges us through the sacrament of the Eucharist is to lay down our lives for one another, to offer our bodies and offer our blood for one another. That is, to do this, to imitate his self-sacrifice, to love one another, and to do so in remembrance of him. And so you see how that interpretation and reflection on the Eucharist adds to this message of, as I have loved you, so ought you also to love one another. This is my bread, which is this bread is my body, which is broken for you. This cup of wine is my blood, which is shed for you. Do this in remembrance of me. That is, offer yourselves for one another. Love one another. By this they will know that you are my disciples, that you have love one for another. So you can see how that reflection on the Eucharist, "Do this in memory of me," referring not just to the celebration of the sacrament, but to the imitation of Christ's self-sacrifice. Christ asks us that if we're going to remember him, he asks us to remember him by imitating him. And that again leads us back to what is the ultimate vocation of the Christian life, which is to love others. And so what I think that we should all be thinking about as we quote-unquote discern our vocation is not get lost in material concerns, not get lost in occupational decisions, which it can even change. We have no obligation to any sort of occupational choice unless we make some perpetual vow and enter into some lifelong state of life, like marriage, for example, or the priesthood or religious life. We make a perpetual vow into a certain state of life. Well, that's one thing, but more generally speaking, we simply have to live out this commandment to imitate Christ by laying down our lives for our friends. And so what I think we should be asking, what I think would be more proper for us to ask, is not what career should I choose or what state of life should I choose. Those are separate issues, related but separate. What we should be asking is simply, what can I do? What can I do to love others? What can I do for others? What can I do to help others? How can I, to some degree, how can I lay down my life for my friends? What can I do that would be helpful to others? And I think if we approach this question from that direction, look at our lives, not the big picture, one decision to be made, but look at our lives in the present, as of right now, considering my current circumstances, my current abilities, my current resources, and so on. What can I do in the present to offer my life, to lay down my life for my friends? And this can lead to an occupational decision. For example, one can say, you know what? There aren't enough priests. My brothers and sisters, even the whole world, is in need of priests. I can be a priest. Therefore, I'm going to lay down my life and seek to become a priest that I may serve my neighbor, and in this way lay down my life for my friends. Not my own will, but God's will. God's will is that I love my neighbor. My neighbor needs a priest. Therefore, I'm going to become a priest out of love for my neighbor. The same thing is true for a monk or a nun. A monk can say, people in the world need prayer and sacrifice. I can devote my life to prayer and sacrifice. Therefore, for love of my neighbor, I'm going to lay down my life and pursue a religious vocation so that I may devote my whole life to pray and offer sacrifices for others. And so you can see how the commandment, love one another, lay down your life for one another, can move into the decision made in free will to pursue a religious vocation or to pursue a priestly vocation. It can also be occupational. Someone can say, you know what? There are no or not many good teachers in elementary schools to work with Catholic children. There are not many teachers in Catholic high schools to help form and direct young Catholic men and women. My brothers and sisters need more Catholic teachers. I'm going to devote my life to become a Catholic teacher because I want to fill this void. I want to serve this need, and I'm going to do it at my own expense. I'm going to offer myself to serve this need, and I'm going to become a teacher to help serve Catholic young men and women. I'm going to lay my life down in this way for my friends. So we can see simply how just thinking about loving others and what we can do to love others. I also think it's worth noting that Jesus doesn't say, he doesn't say, as I have loved you, so ought you also to love me. That's not what he says. Because I thought about that. Many people think about how they can devote their life to God. They say, oh, how can I love God? But that's actually not what Jesus says. He says, as I have loved you, so ought you to love one another. That's, I think, the key to making questions about what we should do in our lives. It's not what am I going to do for God? God doesn't need anything. God is not asking us to do things for him. People always talk about that. They always say, oh, we want to do this for God. We want to do this. God doesn't ask us for things. He actually corrects us on this in many places. One of the Psalms, he actually says, if I were hungry, would I tell you? And the whole world is mine. I've created all these things. I have need of nothing. He's not asking us, he's not begging us to help him as if he has needs. What he actually asks us is to imitate him. He actually asks us to imitate him and to love one another. That's what he says. He says, by this they will know that you are my disciple, that you love one another. Not that you walk around talking about how much you love me, not that you walk around with your hands in the air singing praise songs, singing songs to me, telling me how much you love. That's not what will show anyone that you love me, that you are my disciples. What will show men that you are my disciples is that you love one another. And no greater love has any man than this, than to lay his life down for his friends. So I think the issue that we've got to consider, and this is very personal, which is freeing. You don't have to become someone else. You don't have to imitate someone else. You can ask this of yourself. how can I serve my neighbors? How can I love my neighbors? What can I do? What needs do my neighbors have? How can I help my neighbors? And this can be an isolated present issue, like my next door neighbor just got in a car accident and doesn't have a way to get to work. I can help my neighbor get to work tomorrow by giving him a ride. That's laying down one's life for a friend. It can be feeding the homeless. You can say, this fellow man of mine, this fellow human, doesn't have basic necessities. I can share what I have and help him. That's a work of mercy. And I lay down my life for my friend. And Jesus says, that's how they will know that you are my disciple, that you imitate me, that you do this in memory of me, that you lay down your life for your friends. And again, that's a figurative expression that can be understood in degrees, not necessarily martyrdom. It's not like some men are called to martyrdom and the rest of us just wander around in idleness. No, it can be considered hyperbole, right? To sacrifice, to make sacrifices, to do kind things, to perform works of mercy. They can be expressed as lay down your life for your friends. You can choose to pursue a career because it's necessary. I in fact did this. I wasn't thinking in these clear terms when I decided to do it, but when I was in college, it was really a reflection on the golden rule. I was a college student and I was studying what I considered to be very helpful studies, classical moral philosophy, world history, classical languages, and so on. And I said, man, Christian kids need to learn this stuff. Like I don't know why Christian schools don't teach these subjects. They teach so many other subjects. They don't teach like moral philosophy. They don't teach the scriptures. They don't teach classical languages. And what I said was, I see this as a need in Christian society, because I had the opportunity to take a graduate fellowship at the time in the classics department at Rutgers. But I just felt like that was not a need. I didn't feel like Christian people or even my neighbors in general needed a college professor. What I said to myself at the time was, there's nobody to teach these important subjects to children, to younger children. They need to learn these things before they reach young adulthood and start making decisions. There's a need for teachers of younger children that bring this knowledge, that study these things and gain this knowledge, and then bring it down to younger students. And I saw that as a need in Christian society, and I said, that's what I want to do. So I turned down a graduate fellowship at the time, and I said, no, I want to devote myself to teaching children. I want to work at the college preparatory level, or even earlier. I even taught kids as young as 5th grade at one point. I taught, I was in a private school that was K to 12, but as the classics teacher, I would go down and teach Latin to kids as young as 5th grade. But that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to teach. I wanted to fill a need, which was for a great schoolmaster at that level when the kids were younger. And that's what I devoted my life to. And then the Classical Liberal Arts Academy grew out of that. But I can say that this is actually how I did discern my own vocation, even though I had no idea what it would turn into. I simply saw a need, and I saw it because I experienced it. There were no Christians to teach me as a child. And there's lots of Christians who like to get involved at the college level, but I think it's too late. The issues need to be addressed much earlier. And so I saw that as a need, and I simply said, I want to serve that need. And I was in a position to do that. And so I think that that's really how we should be thinking, and not even to think like a certain state of life or a career or a certain occupation, but just simply, where do I see needs? Where do I see gaps in society, important works, important tasks, important activities that need to be done, that appear to have no one else doing them? And then can I offer myself to fill that void, to serve that need? Can I lay down my life, offer myself as the solution to this problem, that I may help my friends? I think if we simply think like that, the circumstances may change through our lives. When we're 18 years old, the answer to that question may be one thing. When we're 25, it may change, and that answer may be something else. When we're 45, it may change and be something else. And that's more like how real life works. It's not about committing to one specific thing as discovering the career that God destined me to fulfill. That's not the idea of a vocation, because we have free will, and God urges us to choose the most noble thing we can. St. Paul says that in his epistles. He says, desire the more excellent gifts. But I think if we simply ask, based on who we are, where we are, what resources we have, what abilities we have, what needs we perceive, to simply ask, how can I serve my neighbor by filling this need? How can I lay down my life for my friends? And in doing this, we're fulfilling Christ's command in the Eucharist, which is to do this in memory of me, and we're making our carrying out or execution of the real message and significance, the real power and reality of the sacrament. We're living that out and actually making, sort of fulfilling the end of the sacrament and showing ourselves to our neighbors that we are Christ's true disciples. And we show that because we love one another. We lay down our lives for our friends. And so I think rather than, sitting around wondering, what career should I do? What do I want to be? We should simply ask, what needs do I see around me? What needs do I see around me? And if we see a glaring need that we have the ability to fulfill and then choose not to fulfill it, choose to ignore it, then I don't know how we can say that we're sincerely discerning a vocation, when the vocation really is to love our neighbor, to lay down our life for our friends. For example, Jesus saw us needing a Savior, and he offered himself to be that Savior because he could be. A person who is a billionaire could see that the church needs new facilities, or that there needs to be built a new hospital. It could be some magnanimous work, some magnificent work, and some extraordinarily wealthy person can say, you know what, this is a need, and I actually have the resources to fill this need. And a more common person should ignore those issues because they're none of his business, and he should be looking around himself where he is at issues he can actually help with. And so, you know what I see? I see that the church needs faith formation teachers to work with the children. I see that the church needs school teachers to work with the children. I see the church needs priests. There's not enough priests. I see the church needs monks and nuns. I see the church needs missionaries. I see that our society needs honest and virtuous lawmakers, or a good lawyer, or good accountants. I see that our society needs people just to do mundane tasks and to do them honestly and happily. And even going beyond that to simpler things, I see someone needs a ride to school. I see someone needs help with their tuition. I see someone needs, some old woman needs help with household chores. I see some mother in the church who seems like she could use some help with babysitting or with educating her children, and so on. And then to the works of mercy, I see someone who needs food. I see someone who needs a place to stay. I see someone who needs instruction. I see someone who needs some food or drink, whatever. But it makes discerning God's will much simpler, because the question is not what is God's will. We already know that. God's will is that we love one another. The real question we should be asking is, what opportunities do I have right where I am, as I am, who I am? What opportunities do I have to actually do that, to actually love my neighbor? And it's a matter of degrees. It can be from giving someone lunch all the way up to offering myself as a priest in the church, to offering myself as a cloistered monk who's going to devote myself to pray for my neighbors, because I know that in this society where people are so busy, people don't pray as they should, so I'm going to offer myself as one to stand in the gap and pray for them. And that's pretty radical. And then we can see how that goes on to even being willing to physically and truly die for someone, to save someone's life. Possibly, if we think about this from a secular perspective, to be a police officer or a firefighter or a first responder of some other kind. And then going on to be, even a political or religious martyr for the sake of some virtuous cause. So we can see that this is a matter of degrees, and we don't necessarily control the degree. And talking about things that are beyond us is just an excuse to not actually love others. To sit around talking about, ending global hunger, or for a poor man who can barely afford his own home, to be talking about how the church needs better architecture, when that's the concern of wealthy people, not of common people. You can see how we often like to complain and talk about needs that we know that we're not the answer for. That's very convenient, but what we should be focused on are the needs that we are capable of filling. And we need to realize that before God, we're going to be judged for whether or not we loved our neighbor, whether or not we saw needs and filled them when they were in our power to be filled. So I think if we reflect on today's gospel reading on Palm Sunday, as Christ offers himself for us and asks us to do this in memory of him, which is signified by the sacrament of the Eucharist, and if we think about how we can offer ourselves to love one another and to lay down our lives for our friends in our specific circumstances, not worrying about things that other people need to do, but simply focusing on things that we can do, and actually answer those needs and solve those problems rather than fussing about them or complaining about them, actually offer ourselves to be the solution to those needs, then we'll fulfill this commandment that we should love one another as Christ has loved us. I hope that's helpful. It was helpful to me. God bless.